Okay, good evening, everyone. I think I'll make a start. Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. My name is Joshua von Fragstein, and I'm the current chair/president of the NDSA. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a local branch of the RIBA run on a voluntary basis by architects for chartered architects students, as well as non-chartered architects and those who are generally interested in the profession and architectural design. If you'd like to know more about us, by all means, visit our website, ndsa.org.uk, or follow our social media for regular event updates. This evening's event will be slightly different from the ones we've had before. If you're a regular attendee, as I'm sure you'll notice, this is more of a meeting than a webinar. However, we ask that you still keep your questions until the end. And if you have any questions, highlight it by raising your hand, which I believe you can do via the control buttons at the bottom. If you don't have a mic, you can simply add them into the chat box and we can pick them up from there. And also, when we finish the question and we've moved on, please lower your hand as well. So this evening, we're joined by Harbinder Birdi from Hawkins Brown, who will be talking about the Thames Tideway regeneration project. I think with that, I'll hand over to Harbinder. Can't quite hear you, Harbinder.
Great. Yeah, no, that's fine. We're in. Thanks for that, Josh. Let me just share my screen. Great. Hopefully you can all.
Yeah, that's coming through. Great.
Great. And what I might do is just move you down below. Fantastic. So I'll get going. So thanks for having me, Josh. And I was going to talk about a project which is currently under construction. I think we're midway through, which I think is the third largest infrastructure project currently being built in the UK. I think HS2 is the first, then Crossrail, then Thames Tideway. And I'm always surprised at how many people actually don't know what is happening with the project. So so this is us, practice of about 280 architects with offices in London, Manchester, Edinburgh, Dublin, and Los Angeles. And this was in our pre-COVID era. We're all currently still working from home, slowly making our way back into the studio. But this was very much about sort of, I suppose, the legacy of Bazalgette's work and the history of the Thames. So originally, when Bazalgette was commissioned to design the Tideway, essentially it was the River Thames, as London grew, it was a series of sort of like natural rivers which all fed into the River Thames. And what Bazalgette was really doing was essentially creating a whole network of drainage systems which essentially aligned in principle with the existing rivers. But in 1858 there was a big stink, and that's when the River Thames was so polluted because all the sewage was pouring into there that, you know, the ministers in the House of Parliament, you know, they'd open their windows, and the stench was so bad that they actually commissioned Bazalgette to actually undertake the project. And this is Bazalgette, and on one of his sites, and he designed the network, which originally had a population of, I think, 1 million, and he designed it for a population of 2 million, thinking that London's going to expand. The challenge we've got at the moment is London has a population of 8 million, but we're still using a system that is designed for 2 million. And what he did do is there was a first of the kind where they actually sort of developed a series of profiles of tunnel sections that aided the flow of water. So that was the first of its kind. And what he did was that he integrated things like the underground with utilities as well as sewage. And then what he did was that he reclaimed huge swathes of land from the River Thames and created new walkways. And so this is what you see, the embankment. And so that was quite a heroic project built over 150 odd years ago. And what we're doing with Tideway is solving this problem here. So at the moment, what happens is that 300 times a week when there's flash flooding, and especially just recently we've had flash flooding in East London, our system just cannot cope with all the sort of hard landscaping that has been created over London as it grows. And so what happens is that the surface water and the foul water combines, because it's a combined system, goes into the historic infrastructure, and then that overflows. And when that overflows, it flows into the River Thames. And so there's a huge amount of sewage in there within the Thames. And the aspiration is basically to find a new system. So the solution is this. I mean, currently at the moment, what you have is surface water, surface, foul, all combined into a sewer system. So this is like Bazalgette sewer system. What we're doing now is that we're creating, when this overspills, we're creating a new sewer, which is a series of shafts and tunnels, which actually take the sewage away. So there'll only be extreme conditions, maybe once or twice a year, when there's extreme rain, that actually the water will overspill into the River Thames. And so what we're hoping is that the River Thames will become a lot cleaner. And at the moment, it's fair to say that the project is being sort of promoted very much as a big civil engineering project. And this project is split into three sections. You have the west, you have the central, and you have east. And we are the architects for the eastern section. Sorry, the central section. And you can sort of see the sort of mechanics of how it works. I mean, I live in West London, so here what we've got is like a 30-meter shaft, and all the existing sewage network, as well as any other sort of surface water, is connected into the new Thames Tideway, and then it comes all the way down to East London, and then it's pumped out and then it's treated. And these are some of the images of the work sites. And this is actually in Acton in West London. So this is like the first shaft. So this is surface water, foul water from all of West London, which then gets poured into this 30-meter diameter shaft. And it's tucked away behind this hoarding. So what you'll see along the River Thames is lots of hoarding and work sites that they sort of like burrow into the ground. And then you've got a big TBM, which is chugging away, creating a 7-meter diameter tunnel. But it's been a great sort of project, one to engage lots of young apprentices, etc., and particularly get lots more women into the engineering profession, which there's a real sort of shortage of, but also for people to actually engage with what the river has to offer. And so for us, we were commissioned, there was a concept design that was developed by Tideway and their team. And what we were asked to do is to develop those designs, take them to the local authority as well as present them to CABE, and then develop the details for construction. And so what we have is we have 5 different London boroughs, but we have like 7 different sites within there, 5 of which are actually on the River Thames. But on projects like this, what you're having to do is engage with a whole raft of stakeholders. So you have the City of London, the Port London Authority, etc. So you can, it's a real sort of like combined collaborative effort where you need to get all parties on board. For us, the contractor is Ferravia Lang O'Rourke, AECOM are the lead consultant, we're the architect, and then what we have is we have sub-consultant Studio Deck for the lighting and Gillespie's. And then we also work with artists, which I'll mention later. But just the sheer amount of public realm that we're sort of creating in the River Thames is almost the size of Trafalgar Square just on the central section sites. So the first thing that we did is we actually looked, I mean, London's considered like a patchwork of villages, all with their own identity and with their history. And one of the things that Tideway asked us to do was look at the history of the sites, and maybe the public realm that we're designing, the space that we're designing, could reflect or tell a story about that history. So we started looking at the various places, and then the first one is Victoria Embankment. So this is where the monument to Bazalgette are. So this is essentially where, I suppose in a way it's fair to say, he sort of memorialized. And this is a section of the embankment. So this is on the north face. So there's a tube. This is what Bazalgette designed. And what we're doing now is that we're actually creating this shaft here with the engineers, and this is a 7-meter diameter tunnel, which carries all the sewage all the way to East London. But essentially, the project is a piece of machinery that needs to be accessed at all times. So for us as designers, what was a real challenge was, how do you create a fantastic public realm that is open to the public at all times, but at the same time needs to be sort of maintained? So very much about civil engineering, mechanical engineering, architecture, landscape, all working very much together. And you never see the machinery underneath. And this is like a little close-up. Because obviously what they can't do is allow for the mechanics below this to like fail. And so the priority is very much to be able to like service that area. And so this is a view what you'd get of the embankment public realm, and from the south bank looking north. And what we've done there is that we've actually created a series of pavilions. One's actually a cafe. The cafe's on the left with a canopy, and then you have a series of sort of like granite terraces that take you down to the River Thames. And we were very keen to tell the story of Bazalgette, because this was essentially where the Bazalgette monuments were. What we really wanted to do was maybe tell a story of the profiles and the sections and the size of the infrastructure that Bazalgette designed 150 years ago. So what we did is that we etched those profiles that I showed you onto the side of this of the bronze cladding that will clad some of these kiosks. And behind there are actually operational materials and toilets and cafes and kiosks. And overlaid on that, what we wanted to do was actually show the scale of the engineering that we are designing now to service London. And so that's a 13-meter diameter shaft, bronze inset within the granite, as well as a 7-meter diameter tunnel. And then what we did is that we actually overlaid some of those geometries onto our canopy and created a frit. And so what happens is that you've got those sort of different sections creating and animating a canopy, which is then used by the public. So this public realm is free access to all. It's a continuation of the pavement. But what you do have is that you end up having, I suppose, profiles, frits that are set within the landscape that maybe tell you that story in terms of the infrastructure that lies beneath your feet. These structures here are actually ventilation shafts, and you might see them actually if you're in London, the Victorian ones. They're vents, and that form there is actually the profile of the vortex of that 30-meter shaft. When sewage falls down there, it's actually designed to allow for the sewage to fall in the vortex so that it doesn't land on the concrete and impact it and break it. And that's the form. And within those sort of chimneys, what we have is we have this sort of like carbon mesh which absorbs all the foul smells, and they are located on each of the sites. And so this is a view from the embankment, and you can see here where we've got the Portland stone and the granite. What we're doing is that we're actually etching onto there the profiles of Bazalgette sewers that are literally beneath your feet there. And this will be open to the public 24/7. And we see that, you can imagine like New Year's Eve there, this will be sort of like the great vantage point when the fireworks are going off on the Millennium High. So very much public realm. What we really wanted to do was, in terms of our lighting, make the area towards the street well lit, but as you go to the river, the lighting sort of fades away. So essentially what you're doing is that there is no light pollution at the river. And we work very closely with the Illuminated Rivers team, who are illuminating all the bridges on the River Thames. And this is the site, a picture of the site taken about, say, a year and a half ago. But you can sort of see the sort of heroic engineering where you've got essentially like a very large site. You've got the River Thames. It's double tidal. It's actually an estuary rather than a river. It's double tidal. But you're having to create this huge piece of infrastructure surrounded by a real hostile sort of environment. And this is another site, our Embankment Foreshore. That's the MI6 building. And what we were doing there was creating two sites, here and here. Underneath these sites here is all this infrastructure here. So sometimes what happens is that this is the old River Irwell. So the River Irwell used to be the river that naturally fed into the River Thames. It then became part of the Bazalgette's sewage network. And this area here is an overspill. So we're connecting the overspill into a series of chambers, which then gets drained away through a culvert into a shaft and into the main tunnel. And this is the River Effra. So this is part of like Bazalgette's intervention. And this is like a little sort of like gate which allows for the overspill into the Thames. And this was the brickwork that the Victorian engineers and bricklayers created. It's still immaculate. It's still working really, really well. So we're not taking any of this away. None of this is now redundant. It's still working really hard and will be for the next 100 years. We were very keen on these two sites to actually like create a little sort of sanctuary. So there's two different character areas. And on this space here, which is underneath the River Effra, was, you know, a place where it's sort of enclosed, where you really sort of engage with the river. But effectively there's a gateway in which then gets locked. And that was really for security reasons because of the MI6 requirements. So this will be open in the day, whereas the other site will be open throughout the day. Another site was the Chelsea Embankment, where you have Chelsea Flower Show. And there, what we wanted to do, Bazalgette there actually used brick for the wall rather than granite. And what we wanted to do there was actually develop a proposal which was almost extracting the brick out into the river, and it would look as though the public realm has been eroded by the river over time. And what we did is we worked with a lot of sort of like natural contours, but we were very, very keen to actually bring in tidal terraces. So this is like bringing in sort of like vegetation that thrives off the river. And we were also looking at the flood defenses as well. You can sort of see we were actually designing this structure up to like flood levels of like 2065, 2090. So we were mindful in terms of the interventions that we were creating and how that, to make sure that that isn't a breach in terms of the anticipated river levels due to global warming. And so we work closely with the landscape architects in terms of the specification of some of these materials. So we were very keen to try and get as much greenery in as possible. But the challenge there was you've got a big piece of hard landscape with a lot kit underneath. So actually to put plants in there is actually a real challenge. What Tideway did do is that wherever they had to remove trees or vegetation from one of the sites, they relocated that elsewhere. So it was effectively offset. And so you can see here in terms of like the tidal drop, what that public realm looks like. So at one point you are very, very close to the river here. But what you always have is you always have those great sort of like tidal terraces there, which are sort of in sort of like full bloom. And those areas just there, they're actually the gates, should there need to be a discharge into the river. Very much a team effort. I mean, the big challenge on big infrastructure projects is working together in a big team. And actually the data that you need and the drawings that you need to make sure everything's combined. So we actually delivered this using Bentley EcoSim. You know, for each site, there's a team of like 40, 50 sort of like designers working on the project. So one of the things we did was that we did a survey of the existing wall, Victorian wall, Bazalgette's wall. And then we put into that the civil engineering model, followed by the marine engineering model. So obviously you've got sort of piles there that protect the infrastructure there from the harsh elements of the river. And then you've got the service engineering. So these are like very much sort of like the mechanics, the MEP. And then overlaid on that, we've got the architecture and landscape. And this was done for the whole project. I think you've got something like 15, 16 sites along the whole river. And then when it all comes together, we've got like a live BIM working model. And then for us, I mean, this is like a plan. You can sort of see all those inspection chambers and manholes. They need to be accessed 24/7. For us, it's like, what material do we use that almost doesn't look as though all of that mechanics is beneath your feet? And we decided to use brick in continuation of Bazalgette's. And so we have these brick insets within the manhole covers. And so very much it's about sort of making sure that that detail is considered, especially as this public realm is going to be sort of like accessible to all. And one of the things that we did is that we integrated, we were working with several artists, and one of the artists is Florian, who is working with us on the Chelsea site. And on the Chelsea site, he's working with a series of sort of like glazed bricks that we're going to sort of interlace into the brick envelope. And what you'll see there is that it's almost like this sort of like strata within the sort of ground, which he wanted to sort of like reveal using sort of like brick slips. And this was us like selecting a series of sort of like palettes of colors and glazed bricks. And so these will sort of reveal themselves throughout the day, depending on how the light falls on them. It's a very subtle intervention, but you can actually really engage with them both on the riverfront, but also when you're on the public realm. At Blackfriars, I mean, this is one of like the large sites, which is very much in the City of London. And we're creating a huge public realm there that we had to, which was a real sort of interesting challenge. It's like when you've got a large public realm, how do you break it up? And so what we were keen to do was create areas where you could integrate vegetation. You've got quiet spaces here, and you've got larger public spaces here, and then you've got a cafe kiosk, and then you've got certain terraces for you to enjoy the river. And generally what happens is that you've got the continuation of the river walks. What people do is that people jog along the river, they find themselves along here, and they continue along the river embankment all the way down to Victoria. And so for us, this was like a series of terraces using granite finishes, material finishes, bringing in trees, just to break up that space, just to animate it. But at the same time, incorporate a lot of the original Bazalgette wall features. For instance, like here, the sturgeons. I mean, this was a competition that Bazalgette and team led 150 years ago in terms of the design of the lighting. And we were very keen to actually work with a lighting designer, but keeping our lighting a lot more toned down and subtle. And as you go towards the river, a lot darker. And so these are some of the spaces that we're creating. And we're working with an artist on the Blackfriars site called Nathan Coley, who's a conceptual artist based in Glasgow. And his artwork wanted to find, they were called stage sets. And what they wanted to do was take that really vast vista and find ways of breaking it up to frame the view. And so these are some of his sketches, and this is one of his models. And what we're doing is we're carrying a series of monolithic black precast interventions within the landscape, which you can actually engage with. So you can sit on them. Some are going to be water features. And but what they do is that they frame the view around. And so here you can see that that's a particular water feature. And they're great devices just for breaking up the space, breaking up the views, and then animating the journey through the space. And that's Nathan Coley there on the left, inspecting one of the panels, which is actually being sort of like constructed. And we're working closely with ACOM, the engineers who are actually designing the actual structural fabric of that sort of precast unit. So these are very much building elements becoming pieces of art, sculpture that are incorporated into a civil engineering project. And then these are some of the finishes that we've been sort of like modeling and testing. And some of these are currently in fabrication. And then this is working with a whole raft of them. So, you know, the engineers have had a really interesting time working with the artists, the architects, the contractors, and then also the specialists, which is Techcrete, that are actually creating these interventions, which are sort of fixed into the landscape. And they're very much part of the sort of civil engineering. It's almost like quite seamless in terms of the interface between both art, the architecture, and the civil engineering. And finally, this is an image showing the view if you crossed over from Tate Modern, where we have a dark area along the River Thames. And what we're doing is that we're illuminating the public realm on the street beyond. And we see, as London, I suppose, has less and less cars, the sort of streets and the public realm that access this area are going to be, I suppose, more friendly and more welcoming. So what we envisage is that this space is going to be used more and more, not just by people from the South Bank, but also as a destination for people from the from the City of London. And this is the final view, which shows a little sort of water feature. So we've tried to create a lot of spaces within the public realm for all types of visitors from London that are going to be using this space, whether it's children, whether it's the jogger, whether it's people that are working, whether it's people that just want to have a little lunch break. And that's what's been a really interesting journey for us, really, is looking at how you can design space to respond to different people's needs. That's great, fantastic. And that's been done, Josh. So any questions at all?
Hey, yeah, no, that was great. That was a really interesting overview, and yeah, it's surprising that if it's considered, you know, against up there with Crossrail, that it's not really been made it to the public realm as a kind of news piece, I suppose, just yet. So yeah, really interesting insight into what's going on. Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, by all means, raise your hand. Here we go. There's one. There we go. Aboud.
Hello there, I'm Aboud, and I am a bridge and a tunnel examiner as well. And I've personally been inspecting the new Tideway tunnels recently, as part of commissioning some sections of it after the installation. I was wondering if, because they're all blank, brand new concrete tunnels, isn't there any sort of design you guys would leave in there inside these tunnels for the likes of us working in there?
No, really good question. It's odd because we've not been asked to I suppose in a way add any interest to the tunnels, and it's and when I spent a decade working on Crossrail, and that was spray concrete lining, and again, you know, we actually did a photographic survey of the markings that all the tunnels had used. They were like spraying.
Yeah.
You know, they were like various markings, etc. But no, we haven't. You know, generally because obviously with the tunneling there, it's like the spray concrete lining or their precast sort of like elements that get loaded. But that usually is very much the realms of the engineering. For us, you know, we're lucky to get an opportunity to do something fantastic in the public realm, let alone in the tunnels. We'd love to. But no, maybe that's something for the engineers to think about. But I've never thought of that space when you're there for like 5 years working being a bit joyless. You know, how do you create a more interesting environment there?
Yeah, I suppose for those who
thank you so much. Honestly, you gave me a great insight from what's happening actually outside rather than inside.
Yeah. Thanks.
Cool. Any other questions from anyone else? Ben? There we go.
Hi, yeah, thank you very much for the talk. Absolutely. I've got a couple of questions. My first one was kind of directed to you specifically, I suppose. Like, how did you kind of fall into sort of big infrastructure as a sort of direction? I mean, we were talking earlier. You did the New Art Exchange. It's a very different scale and very different type of project. I mean, I suppose aside from the artist integration, but I just wondered what kind of led you into that.
Well, I think when we started off, we had like several sectors, and one of them was transport and infrastructure. And actually, there was an opportunity to work on Tottenham Court Road Station at a point where it was essentially going to the Department for Transport and to the government to get the green light to build. And at the same time, just happened that Crossrail was effectively getting the green light as well, or is being considered. And we got the green light for the project. And so it started, right? So I had to pull together a team to deliver that. But prior to that, I hadn't really ever done infrastructure. So it was a really big learning curve. But then we managed to pick up the Crossrail project, and then lots of other smaller projects in London and then in the regions. Then I think for Tideway, there was an opportunity. They needed a team that could do, you know, high quality design in the centre of London in prestigious sites, working with multi-stakeholders and lots of engineers and contractors. And when you're designing a big piece of rail infrastructure, it's as complex as it gets in terms of sort of stakeholders and what it is. And so for us, we had the skills to do it. And also, Tottenham Court Road Station, it was being designed in Westminster. Actually, it sits in two boroughs, Camden and Westminster. We had to do 2 planning applications for each borough, right? So for us, designing a site in the River Thames, Westminster, it's actually, you know, we sort of know the borough, we know the people there, we know what it is that they want. And then, but I think the big challenge when you're an architect designing in infrastructure is that you are essentially a sub-consultant to the engineers. And the engineers typically are about 85% of the team. So what you need to do is be able to understand how engineers think, how they work, what their priorities are. And so what you're designing are big projects that lots of the public are going to use, that are in the public eye domain. But when you design a big infrastructure, it's there for like 120 years, you know, that's the lifespan. And so they're really sort of quite big commitments when you're working on those sorts of projects. So usually you only get a couple of projects in your career. But you know, you end up getting a lot of people using the couple of projects that you've done.
Yes, I think coming down to the kind of the scale that you're working at, it's one of those that it takes a long time to actually deliver it. But if it's going to be there for 120 years, you may as well take the time to make sure it's correct.
Yeah.
I guess one question from myself was, given the length of time that it's expected to be in use, what has been the kind of sustainable kind of aspects of the project that have been considered? Obviously, there's a lot of concrete in this.
Yeah.
How has that had an impact or had a factor in how things have been designed and considered, I guess?
I think it's fair to say that the engineering team are probably looking at like the most environmental construction techniques and concrete specification for sure. You know, one of the things that we are doing is that we're trying to use the River Thames as much as possible in terms of delivering goods, etc. So there's less disruption onto the public realm. Mm-hmm. You know, we're looking to offset a lot of the trees that we had to take down, and they're being sort of replanted elsewhere. But yeah, there was an argument where some people were saying, look, why do you need the river? Why don't you just green all the roofs in London and allow for that to absorb the rainfall? And Tideway and team did the calcs, and they said it wouldn't be enough. It just wouldn't be enough. Because obviously, when everything goes into the sewage system, it's the surface and foul combined. You know, there's no separate system.
Yeah.
So I think it's fair to say that what Tideway is really doing is it's about discharging the sheer volume of sewage and surface water that currently exists and the anticipation of that as London grows. So London is going to grow by an extra population of 2 million allegedly in the next 10 years, right? That is what everybody's saying. You know? Some people are saying, actually, is it? Everybody's going to be moving to Nottingham and Birmingham, aren't they? That's what they're going to be doing and doing 3-day weeks. Who knows? But there's a real problem at the moment in terms of the quality and the cleanliness of the River Thames. And I think when the project finishes, you'll see a real change in like 2-3 years' time. But I think it's fair to say, I think there's a stat, Rachel Skinner, she's the president of the ICE, was saying that 74% of all the energy that we use as a species can be put under the umbrella of infrastructure. So that's buildings, highways, rail. Yeah, it's 74%. Yeah. So if we can save something like 10% in there, that's a really big figure. And actually what you're finding now is that every designer, every engineer and architect everywhere, the first thing they do is that, can we reduce the carbon? How do we reduce the carbon, right? Whereas 10 years ago, that was never the case.
No, certainly not when I first started. And it was always a bit of a novelty when it was brought up at university.
Yeah.
Particularly from the perspective of the older generation, I was kind of sat there thinking, why are you highlighting this? This is kind of like, now we will design a special roof for the building kind of thing. So it's almost as yeah, it's almost as kind of not doing that is like forgetting to design the roof, kind of, or whatever it might be. Yeah. So any other questions from anyone else? Eleni or Sarah? I notice there's a couple of Ben's back. There we go, Ben.
Yeah, sorry, I just had another one. You mentioned the sort of like the lifespan of the project being sort of 100, 120 years or so. Obviously recently, and I think you touched on it in the presentation slightly, but sort of global warming, and in addition to the sort of growing population and all of that, I mean, is that timescale factor? Well, I suppose not factoring in, but is that targeting anything to do with sort of global warming, or is that more specifically like the physical infrastructure, if that makes sense? Like, are we aiming for beyond what we hope we can achieve?
Well, I mean, so if you look at Crossrail now, when we design Crossrail, the civil engineering of Crossrail is basically the requirements for it to have a lifespan of 120 years. It'll go on for a lot longer than that. And the civil engineering for Tideway is the same. You know, the architectural finishes, you know, we're probably going to have to sort of, because they're underfoot, we're probably going to have to sort of like renew them for sure. I think the project and the size of the shafts and the tunneling is designed for an increase in population of London by 2 million, but also is looking at sort of the level of the Thames in terms of global warming over the next 50 years, so that it doesn't breach. And there's a whole big question about, what do you do? Do you do the Thames barrier and just upgrade that? You know, but if that fails, well, what then happens? You know, which bits of London suffer? And there's lots of like strange apocalyptic sort of drawings showing London in like 2015. But look, I mean, look what happened in East London, right? You know, I've got colleagues that live there. You know, they never expected that. You had like train stations where you know they were like swimming pools, right? It's just like no one expected that, and it's happening now.
Yeah, and the same in Germany. And they have a warning system. My dad was telling me that they have this warning system that pings your phone, and was highlighting that there's actually one, I think, by the Red Cross for the UK, which apparently no one knows about, but does exist. Yeah, and again, in Derby, it's known for the Derwent to flood, but it's a 1 in 100 year, expected 1 in 100 year, but it did it in 2019, and it closed the inner ring road because it got that bad. So yeah, these projects are going to be increasingly common, if not. And certainly in terms of it being done, whether they're in the public eye or not is a.
and you know, and I think the government now has just agreed a substantial amount of money for flood defencing. I think what's going to be really interesting is that, well, what impact does that have on the public realm? As in, like, I just think that there's a real opportunity to consider how that is integrated into the public realm. So effectively, maybe it could become a public community, right? You know, and I think, and I'm just hoping that that's what planning authorities will be looking at. You know, there's a real opportunity to create great public realm, which then doubles up as flood defence.
Yes, yeah, and I think there's definitely some good examples of that in Slovenia, in Ljubljana. They recreated their public realm along the central river, and that looks great. And that integrates flood defences too. Cool. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any hands. In that case, I think I'll close the meeting. I think it seems you covered everything very well, Harbinder. Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone for joining us. This is our last event for July. We will be back in September with another raft of events. So keep an eye on our social media and our newsletter for announcements for what they will be. So thank you again, and I hope everyone stays safe and well over the next 6 weeks, months before we see you again.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Harbinder.
Thanks. Bye then.
Bye.